Okay, so another serious topic for today is the Atlantic slave trade. And this is probably an area where most of you are familiar with. You know about slavery that occurred in America, but you might not know about the extent that slavery occurred in other parts of North and South America. So that's what we'll talk about today. The quote you see on the screen here is from Olaudah Equiano. And he writes a book called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. And basically he's an African slave who would later on gain his freedom and work to abolish slavery, the institution of slavery, and would become very educated. So a lot of times in his book he drew conclusions about the slave trade, about slavery, and also about how free blacks were almost as bad as in society as a slave. So the quote here, it says, "The stench of the hold was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate almost suffocated us. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable." And what he's talking about here in this quote is actually his journey from Africa to the Americas. Like you probably know, they were put on ships in very close quarters, and that's what he's talking about here. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through the lecture. Alright, so origins of slavery and the slave trade. Slavery has always existed in the world. So like John Green says, from the beginning of time until now, slavery has been an institution that has existed. Hundreds of different people throughout history have been made into slaves with little regards to their skin color or place of birth. What makes someone a slave, like John Green said, is the assumption that they're not as good as you. So it doesn't really matter throughout societies what color skin you have necessarily or where you come from. It's just that people who are different from you see them as, so it's not like all black people or all Middle Eastern people are become slaves. It's just who one society sees as inferior. So like we've seen, Native Americans were the first victims of the European workforce in the New World. Because Europeans depleted that population of natives to work for them through harsh conditions, through disease, there was a work shortage in the Americas. So European planters needed large numbers of workers to farm their plantations. They were growing cash crops like sugar and tobacco on a very, very large scale, like hundreds and hundreds of acres of tobacco and sugar. And so their first solution to their workforce shortage was indentured servants from Europe. But they were expensive and only temporary. So what an indentured servant is that it's someone who, in exchange for passage to the New World, they would come from England and work on your farm for a certain period of time. So normally it was like 5 years or less. But they were expensive because they weren't slaves. They were servants, and you had to treat them as a servant and not a slave. So they had to have decent clothes, they had to have decent food and decent housing. And again, they were only temporary. So after their 5 years was up, they were free to do whatever they wanted. And the use of indentured servants only was through the 1600s. It didn't last much after the 1600s. So their second and final solution was, of course, to import millions of Africans to the Americas. And that happens between the 1600s and the 1800s, like John Green said. Alright, so the journey. Most Africans came from the coast of West Africa because it was easy to get between the west coast of Africa and where the slaves were going to go. So, like John Green said, sometimes we think of European traders going in and rounding up Africans and shipping them, but it was also that occurred, but it was also other Africans rounding up other Africans. So they were supplied by African rulers who would go into battle with nearby tribes, and their kind of prisoners of war would be exchanged to the Europeans for guns and goods. So let me show you this map. So you can see here that most of the slaves went to Brazil. So about 3 million slaves went to Brazil, as compared to the not even 500,000 that went to British North America. So that's us. So you can see that this part of Africa in particular was very much impacted by the slave trade. So we'll go back. Okay, so triangular trade. So this is an important aspect of the slave trade. It's kind of that, it's the pattern where the goods and the slaves went through. So the first leg was ships carrying European goods to Africa to be exchanged for slaves. And that's this leg. So textiles, rum, and manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. And then we have captured Africans were marched to the coast and onto slave ships, where they began the second leg of the triangular trade, called the Middle Passage. So the second leg of triangular trade is slaves to the Americas, and this journey that they took here is the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is another name for the second leg of the triangular trade. And then the third leg finally carried American products back to Europe. So this would be raw goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and also stuff like rubber, and because rubber comes from trees, if you didn't know. Stuff like that to be taken to Europe in order to be manufactured to sent to Africa. So it was a cycle that went back and forth, back and forth. Each part of the world had something to contribute to the other part. So having said that, some slave traders just basically sailed directly between Africa and America and didn't even bother with going to Europe because they could make enough money just off the slave trade in and of itself. Alright, so like I said, the Middle Passage is an absolutely terrifying journey for the Africans. So before they even made it on the ships, slaves were chained together and forced into dark, cramped quarters below the ship's decks. So this is a picture of the decks of a slave ship. So these are slaves, these are slaves, these are slaves, and these are slaves. This area, what this is showing right here is probably the lowest level. I can't even count the number of slaves that are here. It's probably a pretty to scale drawing of how slaves were packed into these ships. So like John Green said, each slave had about 4 square feet, and I think that's honestly an exaggeration. I feel like slaves had even less of a place to call their own than that. They couldn't sit down. They couldn't really move around much. So they kind of just leaned on each other to keep themselves up. So like I said earlier, Olaudah Equiano wrote about his own journey on the Middle Passage. And you'll see some of those quotes in a minute. Excuse me. The journey on the Middle Passage lasted about 3 to 6 weeks, and 10 to 20% of the captive Africans who were on the ships didn't survive the voyage. So they died on the way over, and the ship's crew just threw their bodies overboard. So as terrifying as the Middle Passage was, more terrors awaited them when they landed. So this is kind of a picture of maybe what their chains would have looked like. So their hands were chained together, and then slaves were chained together, kind of like dogs. So, yeah. This is a picture of the slaves being forced down into the decks below the ships. Alright.